Right. So, good evening, friends. I'm Dr. Santhosh Babu, IAS. You're an academy educator. Well, this is um, on this YouTube session. The whole idea is to lure you into my plus classes, which now I have changed it from 11th to be from 7:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. every day, Monday to Saturday. Uh, so from tomorrow onwards till 11th, we have an issue because what I had given there was a mishap, and so from the plus classes will be from 11th onwards. But I'll definitely be completing my quota of 45 hours teaching all of you public administration. So we have been discussing development administration. We had seen some of the theories, some of the thinkers, the meaning, scope, significance of development administration. What are the different thinkers talking about it? What are the difference between traditional public administration and development administration, and stuff like that, right? But the whole chapter is called development dynamics. Why is it called development dynamics? It's because development is not static. It's not in an equilibrium state, right? So it's ever changing. So we go through it in decades, 1950s to 1960s, 60s to 70s, 70s to 80s, 80s to 90s, 90s to current times. So basically, development dynamics is about how the concept of development itself has changed over time. And you should know that this is a post-World War development. There are three things which happened. First was there was this what's called decolonization by the colonizing countries, be it Great Britain or France or Portugal or Spain. All of them, were affected by the war, and they had, kind of withdrawn from their colonies. So it's the decolonization created a situation where a new administration from the country had to take over from the colonizers, as it were. Second was that there was a lot of money being pumped in by the US for two reasons. One was to develop the war-affected countries, World War-affected countries. All of Europe was affected, literally strapped by the Germans. So a lot of funding was pumped in, and it's done through what's called the Marshall Plan. And similarly, for the decolonized countries, there was need to bring in administrative changes, bring in quick development, etc. And so there was something called a Colombo Plan. So 1948 was Marshall Plan, 1950 was the Colombo Plan. So Colombo Plan it had a lot of components. In fact, if you look at the IAS itself, a lot of IAS officers used to go to other countries, especially the Commonwealth countries, on the basis of what's called the Colombo Plan. But that is not itself. In itself, it is lots of stuff put together. It will be development aid, it will be loans, it will be these exchanges, etc. Anyways, so development economics had come, or development administration come into existence in the US in the 1950s. And all these major changes are taking place in the 1950s because all the public administration thinkers are basically based out of the US. So we're trying to see what is happening in the US, and then we'll compare it with India from the 1950s to current times, right? So that's what is development dynamics about. So 1950s, which means 1950 to 60, is considered as a golden age of the development administration agenda. Because, one of the thinkers who talked very much about development administration was Widener, and he said two things. One is, he said, it's about economic development. Economic development also means per capita income development. It also means industrialization. It also means infrastructure creation. So he was just not looking at the numbers of the percentage increase, etc. He was looking at all-round development. And he said that if one agency can do this, it is through the bureaucracy. He had immense faith in the bureaucracy to deliver development administration. The problem with the bureaucracy was that they were basically a regulatory authority till then. They had to be refashioned, remodeled, or new organizations had to be created. The structure, authority, etc. had to be changed. to suit the development administration agenda. And even the leadership that they were used to had to be re-examined. So all this being the case, this was an opportunity for the bureaucracy to welcome development administration. In fact, when you become an IAS officer, after sub-collectorship, you are looking forward to becoming what's called the additional collector development, or the project officer, DRDA, District Rural Development Agency. It's one of the most fulfilling kind of postings that you can have, because there's a lot of money and you can play around with money, you can do a lot of good stuff. The only problem with this is that there's a lot of corruption also in this, but if you're an honest person, you can do immense value to the district that you are an additional collector in. So, one of the last 10, 11 years, not many direct recruit IAS officers were posted in Tamil Nadu. A lot of resentment among the young officers that they were not posted as additional collectors development. And when the new government came, they found a large number of young IAS officers, and they are on top of the moon. Because this is something which every administrator, every IAS officer looks forward to. More than regulatory work, IAS officers like development-oriented work. So, thanks to Widener, who always credited the bureaucracy with the ability to transform. And so basically, US followed the Widener's model, and US had suggested this model for the developing countries also. And India also adopted this model, especially after the second 5-year plan. The first 5-year plan was mostly about agriculture. The second 5-year plan was about industrialization, rapid industrialization, creation of IITs, creation of dams, creation of these factories. The only problem with this planning was that it was a centralized planning process. We plan, you accept. It's called the Mahalanobis model, Nehru-Mahalanobis model, where the public sector enterprises came to occupy the commanding heights of the economy, and there was supposed to be a trickle-down effect, right? So that's the development administration in the 1950s. Obviously, state-led growth. Public sector enterprises were the engines of growth because they occupy the commanding heights of the economy. And we all know that public sector enterprises had failed miserably in the 1930s when the markets failed, and the public sector enterprise in the US were entrusted with the responsibility of providing goods and services to the people. Now, what happens with the public sector enterprises is that they become a dominant force. They become a monopoly. When they become a monopoly, what happens is they take care of only the rules and regulations, leaving aside the outcomes. So what happens? The rules and regulations becomes the means and end itself. So that leads to what's called the goal displacement, right? So when goal displacement happens, it's what I call as patient, operation successful, patient died, or is in deep coma, or is killed. Now this is what happens when any organization becomes dominant or monopolistic. And that's why in our Indian constitution we have checks and balances. But during those times, there were no other organizations other than the public sector enterprise. There was a fragile private sector in India. It could not be pumped in with a large amount of money, or could be trusted with a large amount of money, because they didn't have the wherewithal to do it. It was just starting to grow. During the British times, not much of public-private sector was developed. In any case, so the hope for the country was in the public sector enterprises. And as usual, not only in India, throughout the world where public sector enterprises were given the opportunity, they failed miserably. Because what happens is, you become very powerful. Power corrupts, and extreme power corrupts extremely, right? So that's what happened to India also, that's what's happened to US also. There's always been this fluctuation between the private sector and the public sector. And when when Margaret Thatcher came to power in the UK, and Mr. Ronald Reagan came to power in the US, they found that the countries that they had inherited, the economies they had inherited, left a lot to be desired. They felt that this was going nowhere. The public sector enterprises had taken the country for a ride. They had not. They had become instruments for goal displacement, right? They had not achieved the efficiency that was expected of them. They had not been able to deliver the goods and services that the people expected. So what Ronald Reagan told the public sector enterprises was, you perform or perish. So that's the time when they came out with what's called the New Public Management, the extreme right movement, new rights movement, or what's called the liberal movement. What happened was at that point of time was they moved to the extreme right and said that if not the markets taking over the functioning of the public sector enterprises or the functions that these public sector enterprises did, at least we would ensure there will be a thinning of government. The government will be reduced, minimum government, maximum governance. The current Modi government's tagline is that. So there's a thinning of government and also parallel marketization that will happen and an introduction of private sector practices into the government. The whole idea was to make government efficient, economic, and effective. The 3 E's that generally characterize what's called the classical organizations. Even at that point of time, even though the world over everybody was talking about welfare economics, but still the US went through what's called the reinvention of government. Reinvention of government was catalytic government, consumer-oriented government, then what's called decentralized government, then around 10, 12 items: decentralized government, mission-oriented government, result-oriented government, anticipatory government, these kinds of things. They call it the reinvention of government based on what's the book written by Osborne and Gabler, which said moving towards an entrepreneurial government. The government should become entrepreneurial. They should not be doing things what the business can do, but they should know what to do, what not to do. That's what they said. It's not about what to do, it's about the how of governance. So they, based on Gabler and Osborne's book, the US government adopted what's called the reinvention of government. And in the UK, what happened was, this is, we are not, I brought it here, this basically happened in the 1980s. Maybe I'll talk about it that when I reach there. But in the 1950s, it was more bureaucracy-led government. This model is based on the trickle-down effect and the commanding heights of the economy. So you could understand that this was possibly the best time in India also, because there was very little corruption, there was high anticipation of what the government is going to do. This huge industrialization, huge impetus on what's called hunger, food production, etc., agriculture, etc. So this was some of the best times in India when you could look at your own genius and develop, right? So people are treated as just beneficiaries of development process, right? They were not participatory. We always want what's called a participatory government, not even a representative government. We just need people to be participative and people to be empowered to know what's good, best for them, right? So India also basically followed this model. People had high expectations, and look at this sentence, particular sentence. It says that it was believed that political executives, with its commitment to values, and bureaucracy, with its values of economy and efficiency, would bring about rapid economic development. Look at the trust that people had in the bureaucracy and the politicians. That's amazing. That's the 1950s and 1960s were amazing periods where bureaucrats never thought they could become corrupt, or the politicians never thought beyond the country. But today it's entirely different. We call it what's called self-aggrandizing bureaucrats and vote-seeking politicians, right? So 1960s, what happened? The model had failed, resulting in severe economic crisis in the US. 1960s. That's the time when US went to war with Vietnam. There was general discontent with the US because they were the one of the two superpowers, and they were perpetually trying to prevent the USSR from gaining any foothold in any country, including Vietnam or Afghanistan. All these wars that you see, Vietnam War or Afghanistan, all were just to prevent the USSR from gaining a foothold and putting their communism as against capitalism in those countries. In India also the model was a failure. The result of the country facing severe food crisis. The country also had to fight two wars during this period, right? 1960 to China War, 1965 with Pakistan, again 1971. Resources were not even enough to implement the 5-year plan, the third 5-year plan, right? So in the 1970s, this was the situation when we were in a very, very, very what is called unenviable situation. We didn't have enough money to feed our millions because we had barely enough money to fight two wars, one which we won and the other which we lost. Sorry for this. Right. So resources were not. So 1960s was not a good time for India and for the US also. What happened in the 1970s? US changed its development strategy. It opted for what's called a basic needs approach. India also adopted what's called a minimum needs approach. Everybody's talking about minimum and basic and stuff like that. So what they did, they launched large number of development schemes targeting different sections of society. So programs like Integrated Rural Development Program, Food for Work Program, Employment Assurance Scheme (EAS), all these were launched during these times. And instead that the IRDP, there were more goats bought in India than the number of people who had applied for those goats. Obviously, when you buy goats, it'll be in the tens or twenties. But there were millions of goats, and people found a method to take the subsidy by simply showing the one goat and different beneficiaries. These all happened. There's a frittering away of our hard-earned monies. That's the unfortunate part of the development administration that happened at that point of time. Lots of people benefited from this corruption that is evolving, because more the money, more the vultures waiting to pick up the money, and they'll find out methods despite the best efforts of officers. I was an additional collector development in 2001. I used to be an extremely strict IS officer, additional collector. Despite that, I'm sure lots of people flick money because they'll find methods, and there's no 100% method by which it can be prevented. Although your oversight mechanisms, your methods that you employ, etc., will generally bring down the corruption. They're just waiting for you to get transferred, and God forbid if a corrupt office comes, then he will rule the roost along with others. So this has been the bane of India, that the more money that was pumped into the development sector, the more the corruption was, right? And it kind of engendered a system by which rent seeking became kind of fashionable, right? Right. So that is the 1970s, the basic or minimum needs approach. Lots of development schemes we launched in the country. What about 1980s? That's the time I was talking about, the neo-rights philosophy, where they were forced to adopt what's called the new public management. The US had gone through what's called the new public administration in the 1940s, then what's called the public choice approach during the 1960s. Now they were ready for what's called the new public management. And reinventing government. Government was the US NPM strategy, and the UK was all about privatization. They had what's called the institutional economics, wherein the public choice approach was one of the arms for this change. Second was what's called the transaction, what is it called? Transaction approach, and third was what's called the I keep forgetting this. This is too strange. Am I losing my thought? Why should I be losing it? That's what I'm wondering. New public management. Yeah, it's here. Transaction cost approach, and the other one was, let me see. Oh, this is a public choice, sorry. This is a new public management. Yeah. So the basic premises, approaches of the new public management was basically public choice approach, transaction cost approach, and what's called the principal agent approach. Basically, the government had to outsource a lot of activities to the private sector. So the government was called the purchaser, and the private sector was called the provider. So there was a purchaser-provider model through what's called the principal-agent approach and the transaction cost. Transaction cost approach is simple. There is a two-way transaction, and it's not about the price that we are talking about. It's about the unintended consequences of what is called the asymmetry of information. That is, let's assume that you want to sell this pen, and I know that this pen costs around 20 rupees only, but I will be saying that this pen has so many features that I can sell it for you for 1,000 rupees. Then you will negotiate with me and say, no, 1,000 is extremely difficult for me. I may pay 500 rupees. I'll be extremely happy. This pen cost me only 20 rupees. I'm selling it for 500 rupees. So this is called the asymmetry of information. The costs required, to understand the details of this pen, etc., is called the transaction costs. You'll put people on the job to find out what is the actual cost. You'll people find out what are the other transactions that occur. So if this pen can be produced at your premises, but if the transaction cost is lower, then you may as well produce it. If the transaction cost is higher, you may as well produce it. If the transaction cost is lower, you will give to somebody to produce it. So these were the approaches or the basis for what is called the new public management in the UK especially. That's a principal agent approach based on what's called the transaction cost theory and the public choice approach. Public choice approach means giving different choices to people for the same product or service, goods or service through different agencies and coordinated by the government, right? So the US did not adopt this. They went after what's called the reinventing government. So the public sector enterprises were supposed to perform reparation, and they said, they followed what Osborne and Gabler said, that you need to reinvent the government, and that was based on the premise that how much government we have is not so important as to what kind of government we have. And reinvented government in America looked like what is called catalytic government, community-oriented government, competitive government, mission-oriented government, result-oriented government, customer-driven government, enterprising government, anticipatory government, decentralized government, market-oriented government. So all kinds of changes were brought in. So if you can look at this, catalytic government means providing not only services, but also catalyzing sectors into action, all sectors into action in the resolution of problems. So the government provides services, but it also inspires the other sectors into resolution of the problem. Second is community-oriented government, empowering citizens. Then competitive government, promoting competition amongst various service providers. Then customer-driven government means redefining clients as customers and offering them choice in service delivery, right? Then what's called the decentralized government, resorting to decentralizing authority with a view to taking decision-making close to the citizens. Then you have what's called the result-oriented government, measuring the performance of organization based on outcomes than inputs. Governments are always worried about the budgets not being spent, etc. Now you're looking at what's called the outputs. That's called the result-oriented government. Then we have what's called the anticipatory government, being proactive in the sense of preventing problems. That's anticipatory government. Then enterprising government, mobilizing efforts towards earning money. By selling your assets or privatizing, etc., you earn the money. The government does not need to do anything. They just need to earn the money and sit quiet where the private sector provides. And of course, mission-oriented government and market-oriented government. These were the methods by which the development administration took a complete turn in the 1980s through the US and the UK. India continued with the same strategy with investment-led growth, investment on public sector enterprises, especially when they were failing very badly, and also putting a huge amount of funding on the development schemes. So a lot of investment was on public sector enterprises and the development schemes. So what happened was, ultimately it resulted in the collapse of the Indian economy in the 1980s. The country faced severe economic crisis in 1990s, beginning of 1990s, due to failure of the development model, right? So you have to correlate You have to basically correlate um, your Indian experience and the US experience here when you're talking about development dynamics. Development administration in 1990s till date, India faced severe financial crisis due to failure of the development paradigm. It had followed between the 1950s and 1980s. We have not talked about what's called the Inspector Raj. You know that the kind of excise duties that we are putting on our people for importing something was something like 300 to 400 percentage. Now, subsequently it was brought down 10%. You can imagine the kind of relief that would have been given to Indian businessmen. So it is, God knows why that kind of development model. The whole idea was that people should import less. It is called the import substitution strategy, where people produce items that otherwise you would be tending to or tempted to import. A tractor, why should it be imported from the Germans? Why can't it be produced here? So an import substitution strategy resulted in this 300 to 400 percentage excise duty, etc. The whole idea was to conserve an inward looking economy, not to get bedeviled in a sense by imports. Imports they thought would flood our markets and we lose our entrepreneurial skills, etc. But as you know, when you're putting an inspector to see how much percentage you're paying, they'll always take their pound of flesh. And India had become a very, very corrupt country because the policy that we adopted, the Inspector Raj. So more than 45%, the centralized top-down approach to development was a complete failure. More than 45% of our people were living below the poverty line in the 1990s. Today it's somewhere around 12 to 20% is what you say. Some of the states have very little, 6 to 7% below the poverty line. So more than 45% of the population was living below poverty line, even while India was spending millions or crores of rupees on welfareism and developmental schemes. So this was a pathetic state of affairs in the 1990s. So something had to be unleashed. So that's why we're saying we didn't do anything spectacular. What happened in 1990 was not spectacular. It was a response to a situation. There was no other way out, right? So bureaucracy-centric development only resulted in complete alienation of people from the development process. High levels of corruption, misuse and misallocation of resources, nepotism, favoritism, all characterize the development process. This basically happens during a spoil system, right? You're talking about bright young men and women who selected as IAS officers, indulging in this kind of thing. They were not able to stop the corruption. So the country opted for a different development paradigm from the 1990s, and we kind of agreed with Robert Chambers, who talked about what's called the policy of reversals. His policy was that make people at the center of any development policy, because what he was seeing was development, or you could call them armchair development administrators, coming in, and they will come in only where there's money. One, there's money. Second, they'll come in only at particular seasons. They will not come in at the rainy season. The difficult times, they will not be there. Third, they will only deal with the dominant sections of the society of that village. So what will happen is you will have a development model which is very lopsided. So that's why Robert Chambers came out with what's called policy of reversals. Very interesting person. Please Google Robert Chambers, still living, a messiah of the poor. He said, put the poorest, not the villagers. He said the poorest in the village in the center of the development process, and look at it from his angle, and not from the development administrator's angle. So what was he basically talking about? He was basically talking about ensure the empowerment of people and bring the development to the citizen-centric development model, which means Ensuring empowerment is through freedom of choice to citizens. Allow them to choose. And if they are not able to choose, give them the ability to choose or fulfill these choices. Right? So it's not good to say, it's not enough to say that the people don't know how to choose. Create in them the capability to distinguish, make them rational, make them look at all the choices available and ask them to rank it based on highest quality at the lowest cost. That kind of approach is also, it's called rationalist approach, right? People can be rational, very commonsensical, they can be, but the development administrators had not trusted them with taking decisions, so much so that the crores of rupees, the millions of rupees that were being spent was going down the drain because it was not being consulted. The poorest, the beneficiaries as it were not being consulted. So what the policy reversal says is give the freedom to the people to exert their choice, and they are not able to create the ability in them to understand the nuances of the choices available. And make it a bottom-up approach compared to your bureaucracy centralized approach. Make it transparent, legally accountable. Right? Till then it was a bureaucracy, the leadership was all about moral accountability, moral responsibility. Moral responsibility means the bureaucracy does not exercise its temptation to misuse its office, despite the fact that they have access to all this. That's moral responsibility. Chester Burner defined leadership on the basis of what's called moral responsibility. But that's not good enough. It's not enough that you are an honest person. You should be legally accountable for your actions. That's the difference after 1990s in the policy of reversals. And before the 1990s, citizens were subjects to be governed, right? Whereas in the policy of reversals, citizens are subjects to be empowered. What a big difference, right? Can't you just find out what a huge difference this itself is? That is, subjects to be governed to citizens to be empowered. This, personally, to me, is the biggest jump that the policy of reversals took. Then, of course, we had only the bureaucracy providing the services as a monopoly. Now we're saying that we're talking about institutional pluralism, which is the basis of what is called public choice approach. Institutional pluralism, there may be n number of institutions who can supply the goods and services. Leave it to the people to select and have multiple delivery mechanisms. But government can at best coordinate. Don't look at the performance evaluation in terms of rule orientation. Operation successful, patient died, killed, or in coma. But go after the outcome. Find out what. So these are, in essence, what's called the policy of reversals. Robert Chambers. There's a 32-page write-up by Robert Chambers on the policy of reversals, etc. Lots of stuff, where it makes very interesting reading. A bit rambling though, but I would seriously suggest just go type policy of reversals by Robert Chambers, and you will get this 32-page note. Just read through it. If it's possible to understand it. Otherwise, just glancing through it would be good enough, right? So 1990s post was about liberalization, privatization, globalization. Liberalizations means removing controls over the internal functioning of the economy. Globalizing means integrating the country politically, economically, socially, culturally, administratively with the rest of the world. Thanks to the internet, globalization is becoming a fast reality. Your Facebook, your Twitter, your LinkedIn, your WhatsApp, all these social media is hastening this process of globalization. Despite the fact that UK is going through what's called a Brexit, still the world is a much better place today than it was many years back, thanks to the fact that we are all connected. It doesn't take many days or many months to reach out to a person in America. In the very next second, this can happen. It's possible, right? That's thanks to technology. So globalization, without talking about internet, you cannot talk about globalization, right? And privatization, which is basically transfer of ownership. That's the extreme form of marketization, which is talked about or bandied about in new public management, right? So in 1991, the government opted for disinvestment as well as strategic sale of as a part of privatization. Now we come to the role of the state, the role of the markets, how they can be complementary to each other. It's a very, very critical chapter. Lots of questions have been asked on this. The role of the state in the age of liberalization. So when people say, thin the government, privatize, bring private managerial techniques, etc., still there's something called government. Even you may say minimum government, maximum governance, etc., but even this minimum government is so huge, because it carries maximum credibility among all players involved in the development process. No other organization will have that kind of reach. Although today, the Bill Gates and Melinda Foundation, etc., are kind of bigger organizations. Generally, the government is the biggest organization of all, so it enjoys maximum credibility among all players. And it's only the state which can take long-term consequences of its policies. For example, negative externalities, which Paul Appleby talked about. Only the government is capable of understanding this and taking long-term views, because government consults. Government consults every department. Government consults every section of the population. Private sector does not consult anybody. It basically goes through what's called a market gazing mechanism, and they will depend on some of the consultants, young things from the big four, like PwC, Deloitte, and etc., and they will form their opinions. But governments cannot do that. Government has to take care of what's called the unintended consequences of their policies, which include what are called negative externalities. Only the state can. Have you ever heard of the private sector talk about inclusive growth? No, never. The private sector is only talking about growth. Only the government can talk about inclusive growth, which means what? Equitable growth, which means what? Every section of the population is taken care of. There's nobody who is left behind in the development process. And only the state can take care of what's called the socially, economically backward section of society through what's called positive discrimination, etc. Right? Only the state can do it. The private sector will never put their money on a poor man. It's only the government which puts money on the rise of a poor man. Right? What are the strengths of the state? While the markets take care of the demands of the people who are capable of buying from it, state will take care of those who don't come into the market. This is a huge, huge difference. Markets will take care of people who can pay. Those who cannot pay to the markets will be taken care of by the government. And as the state only talks about balanced regional development, equitable development, sustainable development, gender development, ethical development, etc. It's not the private sector which is talking about these things. So, from that angle, you can realize that the government has huge strength in terms of its reach, in terms of its ability to connect with the different sections of the population, in terms of its ability to take care of different sections of the population, in terms of its ability to bridge the gaps where and create what's called balanced development, gender development, sustainable development. Look at the private sector; they don't care about all these things, or they care. Now every private sector is supposed to go through what's called the ESG compliance mechanism, right? So even the private sector is now looking at many of these things. Now, what are the strengths of the market? Market only can bring rapid economic growth. The government cannot bring rapid economic growth, or they cannot bring the kind of employment that the market is capable of doing. The private sector is capable of bringing huge needed investment, can bring in employment, it can bring in choices to customers. Through better competition in the market, citizens can benefit in the form of low prices and better quality of goods and services. So that's a very interesting thing. The price mechanism in a market, because the competition, the price can come down and quality can go up. And through innovation, research and development, market can come up with new technologies that can ensure efficient utilization of resources, right? So these are the strengths of the markets. Markets also provide employment to the people, help in improving the living standards of people. Rapid industrialization and infrastructure development is possible only with a dynamic private sector. And this is proven. Even the countries which have depended heavily on government now depend heavily on markets and give the support to the markets of the private players to ensure that there's balanced regional development, there's balanced equitable development, there's gender development, there's no lopsided development that happens generally. Right? Now, what are the weaknesses of the state? The problem with the state is that state can become a monopoly, and that's much more dangerous than market monopoly. Just imagine, we see a lot of the Pandora papers that have come out. I don't know how many have read this. In today's BBC, around 5,000 investigators have sat across and found out that lots of heads of states and governments have stashed away millions of dollars worth of citizens' taxpayer money in these tax havens by purchasing through what's called the real estate. Even the UK is supposed to have good due diligence mechanisms, etc. But a lot of our, not only Indian, Pakistani, African, American, all these leaders have stashed away. They bought in the form of villas and luxury. You can imagine what it is, right? So the state is capable of state monopoly, which is one of the biggest dangers than, let's say, market monopoly. Market monopoly can always be corrected, but state monopoly is about very powerful individuals and families ruling the roost in a sense. State monopoly can result in dictatorial functioning, right? So it leads to red tapeism, inefficiency, ultimately results in wastage of precious resources of the country. I know you can relate to this, right? You've seen, obviously you're not seeing the corruption in the system. Once you come into the government, you will know the kind of corruption that exists in the minds of people. They're always about scheming and trying to find out. A huge problem when it comes to this computer light. Weakness of state political executive has only short-term perspective and only interested in winning elections. Can result in long-term adverse consequences and high levels of corruption, right? So those are the weaknesses of the state. What are the weaknesses of the market? Let's look at that. Markets can ensure rapid economic growth but can never realize the objectives of inclusive growth. So that's the reason. Economic growth is one thing, inclusive growth is another thing. So it leads to what's called widening of inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth. Functioning of markets can also result in what's called islands of prosperity in an ocean of poverty. Sorry, I have written it wrong here. Creation of islands of prosperity in an ocean of poverty, because they look at only certain areas and where they can invest and make returns. Private sector is always looking at profitability or the bottom line. Government is always looking at what's called welfare maximization. They are looking at what's called profit maximization. Even when they are doing what's called development economics or development administration, the private sector is always looking at returns on investment. That's the way it is, because government is always about spending. Government is not about conserving. It's about spending. It's about, now we are talking about outcomes. Earlier it was about budget remaining unspent, and that would be a very bad thing to do. Do something and spend the amount is what people would say, right? Now look at the markets. Only 5 states account for 90% of the FDI proposals. And you know these 5 states: Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, some of these states, right? Markets are no concern for negative externalities. They don't worry about this. Governments are definitely worried about negative externalities. They have to take care of the poorest, and anybody and everybody is affected by a public policy. It could be a policy to build a road or build infrastructure like dams or put an airport, etc. So lots of people are going to be affected. It can be rich, it can be poor, it can be middle class, but governments need to take care of them. Their rehabilitation. Not only are you willing to give money, It will ensure alternate employment opportunities once they are kind of shifted from there, right? And basically all these kinds of projects very strongly affect the poorest sections of society. They will be thrown off guard. That's why we need to be extremely concerned for the last mile man. And add to all this what's called crony capitalism, uh, giving to your favorite industrialists, etc., giving projects, etc., to them is what's called crony capitalism. So a good functioning market actually results in systematic corruption. That's what we'll see in many of the states which have high, GSDP. Their growth is extraordinarily spectacular, but at the same time, you will find that they are also some of the most corrupt states. Why this happens is because the markets create the money, and markets can buy out people, right? That's the reason why an excellently functioning market can result or contribute to what's called systematic corruption. Now look at this. The private sector always prefer monopoly to corrupt competition. They don't want anybody near them. The multinational companies can easily dictate and influence the policies of poor developing nations, resulting in neo-imperialism. In many of the countries, many of the MNCs actually dictate policies for those countries. So there are business cycles. The problem with the market is there are business cycles, and it ultimately impacts the weaker sections of the society. So these are the weaknesses of the market. Now, what we are essentially saying is that why can't they be together in a public-private partnership, or we call a pro-poor public-private partnership, PPP, that kind of thing. So what are the role of the state and the market together in this liberalization, privatization, globalization era? So this can be through the functions they perform. These functions can be the three categories. The functions which can be performed only by the state, even in a laissez-faire economy like lawmaking, judicial functioning, foreign affairs, armed forces, ecological systems, law and order, etc. Only the state can perform these functions. There's only one structure, and these structures are different structures. They are going to perform these functions. So, in the age of liberalization, privatization, globalization, the role of the state and the market can be defined in terms of the functions they perform, and it can be divided into three categories. Those functions which should be performed exclusively by the state, even in a completely laissez-faire economy, and those functions which can be extensively performed by the market, if not exclusively. For example, any activity whose baseline is profit maximization, the private sector can do, right? And those functions which can be, those which can be performed by the state exclusively, only the state. The other side of those can be performed also by the private sector, by the markets. Third is performed by both together, either independently or jointly, and we call this a public-private partnership. And why can't it be a pro-poor public-private partnership is what we are asking in this PPP model. So infrastructure, industrialization, other economic activities, etc. So in the age of liberalization, what matters is not the quantity of state intervention, but the quality of state intervention. Better governance. An effective state is more important than an all-encompassing powerful state. An effective state which takes care of all the citizens, all the sections of population, is more important than an all-encompassing powerful state. That's a very interesting thing to remember. And what we are saying is the state should interfere in the markets only when it's absolutely necessary. This is called the policy of exception, or you can even call it the subsidiarity principle. You are allowing people at that level to perform the functions themselves. You are allowing the market to do it. Come and put your butt in only when it's absolutely necessary. So the problem with the markets is that markets, due to their imperfections, will always create negative consequences in the form of monopoly, corruption, ultimately resulting in market failure in the form of recession and depression. So we go on to say that market failure can be a double whammy, a double market failure. That's not only the markets have failed, but the um, regulatory authorities also failed. Right? So double market failure means regulatory authorities also fail in addition to the market failure. Look at the US. When they adopted this what's called new public management, a new right philosophy, they opted for hundreds of regulators to control and regulate the financial system, but they have no clue. They did not even identify when this problem is going to burst. So they could not identify the weaknesses of the financial system. So how do you ensure that markets don't fail? That the regulatory authorities also don't fail? They sense the timing, they sense the signals that are coming from the market to say that things are not going properly. If you remember, in the 2008 financial crisis, it was kind of predicted by Raghuram Rajan, who was our RBI governor, when he said that the indiscriminate use of loans, indiscriminate provision of loans to people who cannot afford to repay, etc., will result in negative consequences. And people call him a Luddite because Luddites are negative. So they do not understand when he said that this could have negative externalities. And so it did in 2008. The markets failed in a spectacular fashion across the world. So state intervention is needed in the case of this double market failure. So if 2008, what happened? President Obama was in power, and he saw captains of industry flying down their personal jets. What do? When the going gets tough, the tough goes to government. That's exactly what they did. They went to Obama with folded hands and said, please rescue us from this very unenviable situation. Many Lehman Brothers, all of them collapsed, right? So this is what happens, the government is ultimately able to take up the shocks because it's a much bigger system, it's a all-encompassing organization, and they'll be able to kind of intervene and make differences. Private sector is good and hunky-dory during normal times, but if it's abnormal times, it's only the governments which can make a huge difference. So what is the role of the state? Amartya Sen says markets may ensure efficient utilization of resources. Civil society organization may ensure participation of citizens in the development process. But it's only the state that can realize the objectives of nation building. What a brilliant statement is this. This alone is good enough for a question and for an answer. He's saying, okay, what are the good things about the private sector? What are the good things about the CBOs, the civil society organization? Then what's good about the government? So if it's the markets, they ensure efficient utilization of resources, especially during normal times. Civil society organizations ensure participation of citizens in the development process. But, and it's a big but, it's only the state that can realize the objectives of nation building. Right? What can the state do? State will have responsibility in the form of preventing market monopolies, protecting the rights of consumers, creating necessary conditions for rapid growth and development, reducing inequalities, protecting ecological systems, empowering socially and economic backward sections, removing inequalities, and ultimately realizing objectives of nation building. And this is beautifully captured by Amartya Sen. Only the state can not only realize the objectives of nation building, only the state always thinks about what's called inclusive growth, balanced regional development, removing inequalities, etc. The private sector will never think like that because private sector is not designed that way. It's not about them. It's the way it's designed. And government, because it's sheer breadth and depth, can absorb much more of the shocks. We have all gone through economic failures and shocks. The governments have been able to bounce back and come back and give solutions, right? What we are saying is, why can't the state and the market come together in what's called the 5Ps: pro, poor, public, private partnership. So, but coming together of the state and market is necessary, but not sufficient. What we are saying is, what is required is a 5P approach: pro, poor, public, private partnership. Right? So in the age of liberalization, the debate should not be about state versus market. Now, if you realize, in the first chapter we talked about this, private sector versus public sector. And I said that, you know, we talked about the public-private partnerships and how we can engender that the private sector can become more society-oriented, and public sector can become more efficiency-oriented, and then complement each other to come out with those called public-private partnerships. Now what we're saying is, add two P's to it: pro-poor, public-private partnerships. Your development agenda scheme should be all about partnerships involving citizens. You know, we talked about the policy of reversals, right? So we are also saying that, you know, it's time to think of a different development agenda altogether, right? Oh, we come to one of the biggest points in the development administration, which is called the anti-development thesis. What you need to understand here is, it is not anti-development thesis, it's anti-development thesis. You got the difference? It's not against development, it's only saying the kind of development. So they are not against development, they are only saying this development thesis that your people have put forward is what we don't accept. So that's the anti-development thesis. It essentially criticizes the development models suggested by developed countries for developing countries. Right? The Colombo plan was all about that. How do you suggest models for the developing countries? So administrative thinkers and philosophers from these countries, the countries which are supposed to be developed, India and Southeast Asia, etc., they came out with what's called the anti-development thesis. Anti-development thesis. Anti-development thesis. Development models suggested by development in 1950s to 1990s was the Widener model, which we adopted lock, stock, barrel. 90 LPG and 1990 onwards, based on what's called the Washington Consensus, World Bank and IMF conditionalities, etc., we came out with a different model. And that's the time when this anti-development thesis happened. Literally means a model of development antagonized to the mainstream theories of development. It's concerned with developing alternative practices of development, participatory and people-centered, and with redefining the goals of development. So this basically is the policy of reversals or inaction. This anti-development thesis is the policy of reversals in action. It's also true that mainstream development had also gradually started moving away from the preoccupation with economic growth towards a more people-centered definition of. So it's not as if only the anti-development thinkers talked about this. Even the mainstream thinkers had started talking about this, putting people first in the middle. People-centered development of a definition of development. For instance, human development. You know about the Human Development Index. It's developed by a Pakistani sociologist. It's about learning outcomes. It's about coming out of poverty. There are three things, I think. One is education, second was health, and third was per capita income growth or something like that. These are three things that the Human Development Index talks about. So the entire development discourse could be seen as a debate between three broad schools of thought, or three standpoints: mainstream, reformist, and radical. So mainstream, it says that macroeconomic growth, trickle-down effect. So this is something which is a failed model. Macro, this is called the conventional development model. Second is the reformist standpoint, more moderate theoretical positionings arguing that certain aspects of the mainstream model, especially its neglect of environmental equity concerns, have hindered the development process. That's the reformist standpoint. Third is the radical standpoint. Concludes there are fundamental problems with the mainstream development model and the development practices that emerge from it. So the conventional model, the reformist standpoint, and radical standpoints. So we'll stop with that because it's already time, and hope you have a good time. We'll continue with our conversations. Please join Plus course of Unacademy. I'll be teaching from the 11th onwards from 7:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. So see you there. We'll be discussing questions. You know, the way we are teaching here is not the way we teach there, because here we are constrained with time. We have only 1 hour. There we have 2 hours, and it's daily. Here we have 1 hour every alternate day, maybe for 7 or 8 hours. There it is almost 30 days. So that's a big difference. So we'll get to discuss questions, question papers, etc. And you could also ask questions on the YouTube Unacademy platform. So that's it for the day. Thank you. Good night.